ways, yeah. So I struck right at the beginning of this chapter. We're on chapter 10, White Fragility in Action, at the two sets of rules, right? I should put them up side by side for you. Hold on just a second. I'll see if oh no, I can't do that because it's two different documents. But first of all, there was the unspoken rules, which were these, right? And it's all these things that say, do not give feedback on my racism under any circumstance. And then if you do, then proper tone is crucial. Feedback must be given immediate. You must be indirect, as indirect as possible. All these different ways that we kind of derailed the conversation. So how have you done that? As you look back in your history, maybe you're trying really hard not to do it now, but how is it that you've used this to make it more comfortable?
Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes, we can, Kay. Can you hear us? So how have you made it, how have you used any of these to make it simpler for you? You want me to put those back up? You just let me know.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, Mike.
Nope.
Yes, we can. So I'm not certain if Mike hears us at all or if Kay is hearing us at all. The rest of you can hear me?
Yes.
Okay. We'll keep working on it, trying to figure out. Let me do this and maybe this will help.
Jim, suggest that they turn their volume up. Some people turn their volume way down.
They're not hearing me at all. I can try to send something to them. Let me just send this to them real quick.
Oh, come on. I can't get it off mute.
Kay, you're not muted.
Okay.
Now I'm on.
Good. Can you hear us, Kay?
Yeah, I couldn't until this very second.
All right, good. It looks like Mike is having the same issue, so I'm going to try to write to him as well.
I'm okay now.
Okay, good. Good to have you guys here. So anyway, what I was sharing was these unspoken rules. That's right at the beginning of chapter 10. And there's all kinds of ways that we use to try to derail the conversation, to try to set it aside, to try to get in the way, to try to make it so that we don't have to deal with the hard things. Where have you used those? Where, you know, I was going to ask you, where have you seen them used? Because I know you've seen them used, but that's too easy of a question.
Jim, can
Okay.
you put them up again?
I can. To notice why somebody else is doing it is not near as good as if we notice how we do it ourselves. Okay, so here's the first thing. Do not give feedback on my racism under any circumstance. That's the cardinal rule. And if we don't do it, and if we choose to break that rule, then there's all these other ones, like highlighting my racial privilege invalidates the form of oppression that I experience. For example, I divert the conversation to classism or ageism or whatever. You must acknowledge my intentions. You must give feedback privately. All those things that make it more comfortable for me, but at whose expense? And at what less than full conversation? Contrast that to the second set of rules that she gave us, which was the guidelines for receiving feedback. Where, how, and when you give my feedback is irrelevant. It is the feedback that I want and need. Understanding that it is hard to give, I will take it in any way I can get it. From my position of social, cultural, and institutional white power and privilege, I am perfectly safe and I can handle it. If I cannot handle it, it's on me to build racial stamina. Step 2, thank you. See how simple it should be? We should be able to say, tell me when I'm not doing it right. Tell me when I've hurt the distance between us. Tell me when I've stood in the way of your feelings. Tell me when, tell me how. Even if I don't agree, why is it that maybe especially when I don't agree, why is it that I fight it rather than stepping into that space of listening?
I think that compares to, I believe it's Marshall Rosenberg's nonviolent communication, where he says, let me hear what you have to say, and let me see if I can repeat it to you, and if I got it.
Yeah.
Is that the same kind of strategy?
Yeah. The bottom line for this is, do I listen first or do I defend first? And
listen for sure.
Well, I mean, that's what we should do. The question is do I do that?
I think our intentions can be good, but the actuality of it brings up our defenses.
Yeah. But that's where we have to be very sure about that second set of rules, that I listen and I allow that person's voice to come into my heart rather than fight it. Paula.
I think from that first list, I believe I have had a belief that it needed to be given privately and quickly. So kind of two of them. And that if I couldn't do it soon after the incident, then I'd have to let it go because too much time had gone by and it didn't feel right anymore.
Yeah. Yes, because and that's all kind of built into that system of protection. Remember that in many ways, that's why all of that is there, to make it so that we as white people have a safer space for us. Remember that safer space for us usually comes on the backs of somebody else's oppression. If we get a better voice, it's because someone else doesn't get as good a voice. If I feel comfortable, it's often because someone else is uncomfortable.
Isn't that an assumption?
It is an assumption, but we'll deal with assumptions in a little bit. In the next chapter, she told us why assumptions are assuming that we shouldn't have assumptions is an absolutely incorrect space. We all have assumptions. It's just the reality of things. So let me tell you a story. This week I posted a meme. It was an interesting little meme, a little cartoon meme that essentially dealt with the phrase defund the police. One person saying it, one person arguing and saying, you can't say that. And then this first person said, but it means, and essentially the first person's thing was, it doesn't mean taking away money, it means changing how money is spent, essentially. So it started a conversation in my Facebook feed, and some of them were very good progressive people that were saying, oh no, we can't use that word because it's offensive. Not my choice whether it's offensive or not. We use that, and what they meant by that is it's offensive and it's not very helpful to our conversation. But what essentially it was doing, it was making it so that they were not listening to people who chose that term, defund the police, and they weren't hearing why that's important. It's a bad term. Don't get me wrong. It's not as helpful as what we think, but I don't get to choose that term. Someone else did, and I can choose to hear why they chose that, or I can explain it away to make myself more comfortable, or make it easier for me. That's what this conversation today is about. How is it that I make it easier for me, but at someone else's expense? Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, especially in light of the fact that the head of the police department, the woman just resigned
Right, in Seattle.
in Seattle. And she resigned over the fact that they were going to reduce her salary and defund part of her, her staff, part of what it was she was responsible for doing, without any discussion as to how it is that it could be done better. Let's just defund it.
There's no doubt that the conversation sometimes goes in ways that I don't think are the best of the conversation.
Right.
The question is the term.
Yeah.
Right? Where people want to explain away the term and have the conversation be about the term rather than the issue.
Right.
All of the first set of things that I showed you, all of those ways that we break the unspoken rules about how to give people feedback, how to give white people feedback, are ways of changing the conversation to make it easier for us rather than being in the difficult conversation that it needs to be.
It's made more palatable.
More palatable. How many are kind of enamored of having comfort around you? I kind of like it. It's not a bad thing. In conversations, though, comfort is not always a good thing. Leticia.
Do you remember, Jim, when Arizona was having this conversation around Latinos?
Maybe. Tell me what you think.
This was in the 90s, when we were being stopped and asked for our papers. And I got stopped at one point, and all through the 90s, I could not drive comfortably without my birth certificate, my social security card, and my voter ID registration. And I had an officer stop me one time, and he greeted me in Spanish, and I just smiled at him. I said, "I'm sorry, my Spanish isn't very good. How can I help you?" And he said, "Can I see your papers?" So I handed him my title and registration. He goes, "No, your papers." And I said, "You mean my citizenship papers?" And he said, "Yes." And I told him, "I will show you mine when you show me yours." Now, I know the conversation through White Fragility is around the Black community, and they in the urban areas, they've suffered terribly. But the institutional racism goes against anybody who's different.
That's right.
Anybody.
It isn't just anybody, but what we're talking about here specifically is the color of your skin. Now, Leticia, I didn't know in the beginning who you were, and I didn't know that you were Spanish or Mexican or whatever your heritage was at all. So it would have been hard. I have to meet you to
Mary?
see. Do you really have colored skin?
I do. It's more of a Mediterranean dark, and this year I haven't been out in the sun as much. But I am olive complected.
Yeah, I understand that.
I have the education. I have the mouth to go with it, right? So, but I spent, because I have a little bit more education than a lower income Hispanic, I have spent my lifetime as an adult working with empowerment activism among Hispanic communities here and in Utah.
So at the end of the conversation, towards the end of the chapter, she writes this: "Of course, we would ideally guide each other in this work with compassion. But what if someone does literally point a finger and boldly say, you are racist.
Well, because of this class, I would respond, yes, I am.
And
To try
hopefully
to-
would say why. Help
Pardon
me
me?
to understand.
Yeah.
The challenge is how are you going to do that? So Mike, let's get to the things that you were talking about before. Look, here's these false guidelines for building trust. The problem is that we've all been taught these types of things to be able to help us be better in group conversations. Don't judge. Don't make assumptions. Assume good intentions. Speak your truth. Respect. How many have heard all those things being held up as things you should do in conversation? They're not bad things, but they can be used wrongly. Like she says about judging, that's not humanly possible. Right? We all judge. We make those. And so if we, as a white person in a conversation, suddenly jump on someone because they judged, it may be because we're trying to divert the conversation. It may be because we're not ready to hear the harsh word they have to tell us. Right? All of these things that are here can be used to benefit me as a privileged white male rather than open me up to listening to the person who is in front of me. How do I allow myself to be uncomfortable in order to not coddle my fragility, but to hear what it is that someone else is saying? And here's the second side of that. How do you, when you step into conversations with those people around you, the deep, important conversations where you are going to challenge their white fragility, what do you do when they start bringing up these rules to you?
I have to say, there's been difficult moments for me within this class, specifically for that reason.
Yeah. Most of our brothers and sisters of color have learned to be relatively quiet around racial issues because of our discomfort. And somehow we have to reverse that trend, not just in ourselves, but in the people around us.
Letitia,
Yes.
say more about being in this class and not feeling comfortable sometimes.
I'm not going to point him out specifically, but they were so shocking to me that there were 3 specific times where I was trying to convey what my experience is as a person of color. And I've had people say, okay, I want to get this back to the Black issue. And I didn't know what to say.
Or you were feeling marginalized. Tell me what you were feeling when you heard that.
Yeah.
No, I was feeling shut down.
Okay. Yeah.
Not marginalized, just shut down.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And Jim knew, he knows enough of my expressions, he knew those moments. But culturally, we don't object. We just go, okay.
The purpose of this class is for us to learn how to say something to you when that happens, or to the person who said, let's talk about Black people, which is what we're supposed to. We're talking about people of color. And the Black, also, we're at the same time, we're talking about what happened with slavery and how that has incredibly impacted the ethos of this nation.
Well, and quite honestly, Mary, consider the Hispano-Latino time frame along with the Blacks.
Yeah.
Especially the Latinos, we're conquered people, just like
Yeah.
the Native Americans, just like the blacks. But we're not viewed that way. But we're definitely treated that way.
Yeah. Yeah. So how do we, in a situation, ensure, especially when we're talking about racist issues, okay, if we're trying to have that conversation, how is it that we do not give in to white comfort at the expense of Hispanic, Native American, Black voice being heard? What are you
I
going to
put
do
the foot
when you're
around
in
it.
one of those situations?
I'll be honest with you, working with Native American and particularly, I kind of dance around any real issue. I mean, it's very difficult to acknowledge. Where do we start?
And with the
Native American. Go
Mary,
ahead.
if you've worked with
Yeah.
Native Americans, they're not going to go into a confrontation or be in conflict with anybody. They'll shut down, right? Because it's rude. They consider it rude. And the Latino community is closer to that idealism than it is to the blacks. So you have three very different cultures speaking very different languages, but they're all being treated the same.
Right. No, you are right about that. I've been fortunate enough in the Native American, only with the Lakota Sioux. I know nothing else about many of the others. Being accepted and having someone point it out to you very directly, very harshly, who you are, who I am. In other words, they're pointing their finger at me. What have you done? This is what you've done, who you are. And it's very uncomfortable.
Well, and she was very clear about that. It should be, right? She's saying this conversation should necessitate our discomfort.
Yes.
Because if it's sitting in a space of comfort, it's probably at the expense of a person of color being able to speak and have a true voice.
Jim, she also said that it was time for the whites to talk among themselves. Right?
That's exactly part of why we're having this conversation here, so that we can begin.
That is also why I didn't speak up.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That's part of, Mary, that's part of self-reflection for any of us, right? Or am I screwing up? So, at a certain point, I stepped back and went, it's not up to me to make you self-aware, Mary, or Maureen, or Joyce, or
whoever.
Right?
Yeah.
So I got to tell you my reaction. My first reaction to the chapter 11, White Women's Tears, was before I ever started to go, phew, finally we can talk about somebody else's issues, not mine. Those white women and the way they cry, and that's not me any longer, right? And of course, in the middle of it, she started talking about white men's fragility, and so I had to deal with that again, right? But
you and Mike have the same problem, because he and I have been talking back and forth about the White Women's Tears, and I maintain it's very powerful. It has been in existence for a long time, up to today. Even if you want to talk about Emmett Till, which goes way back to Mississippi and, I don't know, 50, 60 years ago, it's still prevalent in that woman in the park with the dog.
That's right.
Who called the police and said, there's a black man who's threatening me, whatever she said. If he had not been there recording everything that was taking place, when the police showed up and he didn't have that recording, they would have believed her before they would have believed him. I'm convinced of it.
A very, very immediate example that we have to look at and see. And this was a woman that, by all accounts, was a relatively liberal woman, right? Not a conservative, who is taking that role because it's easier for her, but at his discomfort.
Yep. Mike, speak up. You and I were disagreeing on this.
Well, I'm not sure whether that was for the same reason. What I started thinking about were my own tears.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
What stimulates my own tears, whether it's a woman or not? Why, when I'm watching Whoopi Goldberg in the movie and the children are succeeding and they're joyful and there's music and I get tearful. Or when I listen to you generate, after hard work, do a sermon, I get tearful. Just like I would if I had a 13-year-old daughter start a recital. Tears are an emotional issue, and it's not always how we understand them. They're there.
That's right.
And they're uncontrollable sometimes, but it's important to be able to reflect on what was going on once it's over with.
I think
That's
the
what
issue.
I see. What?
Well, go ahead.
Well, no, that's all I see. I mean, I have to reflect back on it and say, what happened to me? And I think that again, what I have somehow learned over time is in any kind of a communication with, first of all, coming together with a common understanding of a topic, and then ask, will this be an equal exchange as well as it can be?
Yeah.
Oh.
And without judging one another, let's try to avoid it. And if I get judgeful, then call me on it.
The issue with white women's tears is a little bit different though, Mike. So let me divert the conversation just a second, because
Sure.
I think what you've said is right, but here's the issue with the tears. Whether yours is a male or your wife's is a white woman, right? It is if that diverts away from the issue at hand, okay? And so the question was, in this woman, the example she gave, the woman tears up and all of the concern suddenly shifts over there and forgets the story that was being told about the white man. And so he and the injustice around him gets lost in order to do this. So I liked what she said, where she's often in a space of emotionality, of struggle, of how it's been done wrong. She says, when I do choose to get emotional, first of all, she says she tries very hard not to in the midst of these conversations. But when she does, she tries to divert the conversation back to what's the matter at hand. Her emotions around this issue are not the matter at hand.
Right.
The issue is.
And you'll hear from ethnics when that's done, from ethnic communities, they'll say, I just love how the white people want to speak from my experience.
Yeah. That's like saying, I'm oppressed too, Letitia. As a woman, if you want to take that gender issue.
Yeah. It's good and important that we have those emotions. Don't get me wrong. I'm glad that we feel hurt when someone else is hurt. That's good empathy. The question is does my feeling hurt take away the solving of the issue? Does it take the attention away from somebody who needs that attention more? My tears need that attention.
It certainly opens the door to the issue.
It can for you, but what does it do for others?
I think I'm a cheery person, and so I've had that criticism in my job over the decades.
Yeah.
And I think that it was looked at as I was trying to manipulate the conversation, and that wasn't the case at all.
Yeah.
They just come for me, and I can't necessarily control it when I get cheery.
Yeah.
But it isn't a manipulation, but it was sometimes looked at that way.
Yeah. But I think what you're saying, Kay, because I think that it's right to have those tears. We just have to make sure that unintentionally we don't divert the conversation. Maybe not manipulate so much as remember to drive it back to what's most important, right? I think what we have to remember in most of these things that we're going to talk about is it's not about how it makes us feel, whether it's anger or sadness or whatever it is. It's about what's being done that's helping, that's making it so that some people don't have equal space in America today.
What can we do to fix it?
And what can we do?
Right.
And we should feel pain about that. We should feel anger about that. But it's not about my anger. It's about them, first of all.
Yeah.
That's the question, is how do we divert it back to that space? How do we say, I'm feeling emotional about this because, and we point it back that direction. Look at this injustice.
I think that's exactly how you do it.
Yeah.
If you're the person who's tearing up, you have a responsibility to make sure the conversation isn't redirected to you.
Right.
Ah, good.
Right. That's the issue today. Because, you know, all of us to some extent like it when someone acknowledges our hurt. But if I'm hurting relatively in a small way compared to the hurt that's making me hurt, does that make sense?
Yes.
It's that larger hurt that's making me hurt that should be focused on.
And Jim, that occurs to me, that's the place where we need to take some kind of action.
That's right.
And I think you had talked about it earlier, because systemic racism and putting other people out of the mainstream is something that's built into our system.
Yes.
So that's where we need to be working. And it strikes me that's where white people who care about this a lot should be saying, I may have to give up some of my privileges, but it will make it better for all of us.
Or maybe even better said, you're right, it might mean I have to give up some of my privileges, but we have to start saying, is if I like these privileges, if this is where I want myself to be, I have to start fighting for those privileges to be universal.
Yeah.
If I'm not willing to give up these privileges, then that other person should have them as well.
Right.
And we can't just continue in the space of seeing poverty on a grand scale in colorful in neighborhoods of color without questioning the divisions of our economics.
Economics.
Jim, I have to tell you, I had a reaction to when you said we have to give up our individualism a week or
I didn't
two.
say it that way. I'm sorry. If I said that, that's not what I meant.
Okay. Now, but as white people, right, that we had to that there had to be a let go of some of the individual.
Yeah.
And I went and talked to my friends, you know, over a couple beers, and we talked about this class, and Black and Hispanic, and they all went, wait a minute, that's what we're fighting for. That ability to move forward as individuals, that promise of the American dream that we get cut off from.
That's right.
And so it was an interesting reaction. I just wanted to share that.
Yeah. I do not in any way want to say, I don't want to speak against anything that you said, Leticia, because you're exactly right. That's what we want to have there. I just don't want to, if I'm saying this is good for me, then I want it to be available to every single person around me.
I got an answer for that question on the book cover in the next class.
Oh.
Hard? Oh.
Because I could have very easily, because I'm surrounded by Latinos, and I could have very easily gone the route of Chicano La Raza activism, which is very, very anti-white, right? But I chose not to because during the development of myself, I'm a humanist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And every single body I come into contact with, no matter what color or if they're dirty or clean or whatever, they get the utmost respect and the utmost dignity that I can give them.
Yeah. So the hard part is when you mention the different ways that Latinos react, it's kind of like going back to who was right, Martin Luther King or Malcolm X, right? And we told who was the correct way of doing something. And
what was Malcolm X's final name, though?
Well, but it doesn't matter to me what they both said. It matters to me how I react to them.
Exactly.
Yes.
Right? I have to say, what valid point does that person have, even if I don't like all their methods?
Yeah.
Because we do a whole lot. There's been so much conversation right now around the Black Lives Matter that says, oh, because this happened, because they were doing this, then I don't have to listen any longer.
Mm-hmm. Well, here's something that I pose to Latinos and Blacks. Were Martin Luther King Jr. and Cesar Chavez Black and Hispanic activists, or were they human rights activists?
Human rights.
Well, of course.
Ultimately, you're right.
Yeah.
And
But what happens is,
and do I have the courage to truly listen, even when the message is delivered in a way that's hard or even offensive to me? When the person is in my face screaming at me being a racist, do I defend myself against that attack? Or do I hear the anger and the need in that other person?
well, when you were speaking about Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, correct?
Yes.
I never bothered to find out very much about Malcolm X at the time, and I'm guessing that most people didn't, white people didn't bother to find out very much about him at all. And so I came to my own conclusions, which we call assumptions, about who he was. And I saw him as the violent, radical side of the message that Martin Luther King was bringing forward. I didn't bother to listen anymore. I didn't bother to ask any more questions.
Right.
It was too much effort.
And excuse me, Jim, but Malcolm X, if you read his messages from the time of his conversion to Islam, went 180 degrees in the.
But my point is, I didn't listen.
Yeah,
that's my point, and I don't think that I'm an aberration when it comes to that. I thought I was pretty, open to these kinds of differences, but I didn't listen.
Yeah, but that's what we've often done, Mary. We've chosen the right Black man to listen to.
Right.
The easier,
softer one.
Softer voice to listen to.
Right.
And maybe even, it's right, I think Martin Luther King had the right ideas, but it doesn't mean that I shouldn't listen. Doesn't mean that I shouldn't hear. We should tell the stories that we have heard, not just the Emmett Tills that we've all heard about, but all the other stories that are difficult stories to listen to. I think I told you a while ago about the movie Rosewood. It was made in the late 80s, early 90s by John Singleton, one of the premier Black filmmakers. You should watch anything that John Singleton has done. It'll help you understand the Black experience in America. But the Rosewood is about a small town in Western Florida, right? That essentially was destroyed because one white woman cried, right? And it gave the white communities around Rosewood the permission to go and kill anybody they wanted to in that community. Essentially wiped it out to where, as far as I know, it is not a community to this day, almost 100 years later.
Wow.
But that's not an isolated story. It's just one of the, it's just one that John Singleton used to be able to illustrate how often that's been done. They listened to one white woman's tears more than to everything else that was going on.
What I find helpful about a group of people like this is, and I think Mary pointed out something that's pretty common, because I'm not educated about something, I make an assumption.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so what is needed is more education for what is not where assumptions exist. And I think the white population, because of the superiority supposedly and all kinds of other reasons, makes the assumption that any person of color is in a different category.
Yeah.
And and for certain happens in their lives or reasons or events, could be that way.
In the backyard, but I did not smoke in the room. And I don't have any more weed.
I also think that the black and the other, not the, just the people of color make assumptions about whites, all justified.
They do.
So we live in a life of assumptions and conclusions, and then behave accordingly.
Sure. Let me give you just a slight variation on what you said. You used the term that we all need education. I think what we need is relational education.
Yeah, well, yeah.
We don't just need to learn more about them, about things. We need to be in conversation with people.
Communion.
We need to have communion. Exactly
How
right.
how do we do this? You know, part of the conversation that I'm listening to about education, and I was mentioning this to Mike, was that people have established safe pods, if you will, have deliberately made contacts with other group of individuals in which they've agreed to share time together. And otherwise, how else am I isolated here? I don't tend to be one who goes out and knocks on doors, and you know, I wish I did that sort of thing, but I don't. And I'm feeling very isolated. If I could create a pod of about a half a dozen people at least, that we could meet once a week and be in relationship. And I know Joni sees the same way in teaching. It's about the relationship that you have. The children, my nieces and nephew, Mike's younger sister's kids, they're all isolated. They have never lived, these little tiny kids have never lived a life where they have been in relationship with other children. You know, it's happening to us, although as adults we have this to remember, that we have been in relationship, we have been in social contact, but these little kids haven't. This concern,
Mary, the good news is our children have been in racially mixed spaces much more than what we were growing up.
Yeah, that's true.
yes, that's also
They've
true.
got advantage to it, but they also have some of the disadvantage of, because of that, they have some very hard things that are being carried forward too. And so we have to continue to work to make sure that we help them to have a full recognition of not just their truth, because our white kids get to have a certain amount of prejudice if we're not careful because of their privilege. And we need to make sure that we're fighting hard to make sure that doesn't happen, that we are truly helping to raise them better than what we were raised.
And it's the margins that I'm concerned about the most.
Yeah. So let me tell you some of the issues. I love being at St. Francis. St. Francis has one of the most open hearts as a church, but you know what surrounds us as well? The castle walls, I call them, of sitting in the foothills and having the moat, the Rillito down below us, which keeps us away from, right? Gives us a certain amount of insulation from.
Yeah.
How do we go past our castle walls and walk through the moat to get to the spaces where we can have these kinds of conversations? It has to be intentional, and it has to be deliberate, and it has to be continual. It can't be just a conversation every once in a while.
Jim, do you remember the suggestion I gave you when I saw the slide presentation about St. Francis helping a church down on the south side?
Yeah.
And my reaction to that?
Tell me what.
It was a very moving sermon by Raleigh.
Yeah.
And it showed folks from St. Francis doing a in-service day. And I can't remember which church, but it was a Southside church. And I noted that they showed homeless and Latino people walking around getting plates of food, but there was no combination of white and brown faces.
Yeah.
In the slideshows. There were photos of St. Francis folks standing together arm in arm and grinning, but there were no pictures of them serving the food to anybody. There was no pictures of anybody at St. Francis on eye level with children, interacting with children.
Yeah.
And it was really, for me, it was a really conflicting watch.
Yeah. I think that's what you always have to be careful of. For example, oftentimes when churches go and feed the homeless, what they mean is they stood behind a table and dished out food but didn't really touch.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, there, don't touch them.
And my suggestion to Jim was, why don't we go? Because a lot of, like every place else we've done to zero landscaping, right? Why don't we get, rather than feed them, go and help them set up a community garden in their dead garden space?
Yeah, how do we do some things that put us deeper into relationship in the midst of it?
What were you going to say, Kay?
Kay was going to say something.
One of the groups that St. Francis has sponsored from the very beginning, but has a little more distant relationship now, is Iskashita. And that's working with the refugee population. So that's very much cross-cultural, cross-color, cross everything. And that is a very good example of, you make friends, you work elbow to elbow, you harvest, you make food at the St. Francis kitchen. So it's good. And then Tihan's another good example.
Yes.
It's not cross color, but it's cross
culture.
Yeah, I mean, it's cross identity with the gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender population. And St. Francis, yes, it serves them, but we also are very active together and we work together. So it's not, I mean, I agree that working at a soup kitchen, sometimes you don't meet anybody other than smiling as you serve the food. But that's not the case with Iskashita, and I don't think it's the case with Tihan either.
And I was going to bring up Iskashita because I think Iskashita is a better example of what we want to do, a better model for us. So we want to make sure, and part of the reason why that model works really well is because Barbara is eminently relational, and she makes it so that everyone else has to be. Right? She draws
whether you
people
want to or not.
Yeah. And part of what we want to really do is, as we look at the ministries we do, whatever it is that we do, we want to make sure that it's where we are deeply connecting to people and not surface-wise. Paula.
I want to give a little story. Do I have time? A Iskashita story. I think most of you know, but maybe you don't, that for the last 2 or 3 years, I've had asylum seekers living with me. I mean, I had Deo from Burundi for 3 months. I had MA from Rwanda. I'm sorry, I did them, those were backwards. Deo's from, MA's from Rwanda, and he lived with me for 1.5 years, and he still considers himself part of our family. And then now I have Richard from Uganda living with me for about a month now. And Richard, the very first day he was here, went harvesting with us with Iskashita. And we went to one of the mobile home communities and he made friends. I mean, he's a Baptist minister actually from Uganda. So I was a little worried about how conservative he might be, but he actually made friends with the manager lady who was helping us figure out. We did some harvesting there for 2 or 3 days. And then she asked him if he would come and help her out and sort of under the table, because he still doesn't have a work permit, work for her. And it turns out she's a lesbian woman with a partner. And so that's been wonderful. Yeah. So he's Black, she's white, he's working in this community and being very well received, which is an all-white community. On the other hand, he's also working with a lesbian couple, and that's just expanded his view. And it's just been really special. It's been very special. And when I started having these people live with me, so that's like maybe 3 years ago now, I worried about my neighborhood because yes, I see there are some Black people who live in the townhouses, just not, well, right next to me actually, but it's still pretty much a white middle-class neighborhood. And yet when I had these Black guys living with me and going out on walks, I found out the histories of some of my neighbors that I didn't know. A lot of them Peace Corps histories. One lady worked in Tanzania, another man worked in the Dominican Republic, and they were welcoming and delighted to have a Black face in our neighborhood. And it was, so there are some good things going on. And I was just delighted because I was afraid that they might get scorned or whatever. And that was the opposite of what happened. Nice. Many, they actually came running out of their driveway to meet them.
The good news, what I hear you saying, Kay, is that relationship will get us past our white fragility if we allow it to happen first. If we push that, and it means getting into that discomfort zone, but relationship will allow us to say, "I will because of." Paula, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I wondered in the pre-COVID world if an attempt had ever been made to like pair up with a church that might be a Black church or whatever for like a study group together to like work through a book or any, you know, has that ever been tried? And can that work? Is that a way if people commit?
At our 1045 conversation on Sundays, that has been brought up, and the closest, easiest church that we can get to right now is an Ethiopian church that is connected through Ishkashida and can begin to have some of that type of conversation. They're going to bring different issues than typical American white racism, but it will be a good conversation for us to have. And the reality is that I think we need to find several different ways of being able to do that.
Yes, because the kind of racism we're talking about here is the enslavement of Black people. And people today from Ethiopia have no, if they come here from Ethiopia, have no understanding or background, or what do I want to say, Sitz and Leben, no situational understanding of what racism is in this country. Yeah. Because of the slave culture.
Yeah.
And we as Americans, all ethnic groups as Americans tend to look at those are different Blacks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
Those are real Africans.
Sure. But the conversation is this: how all do we extend ourselves beyond whatever I describe as the me, and place myself intentionally, purposely into a situation with someone who is not the me, right? And step across lines, not to go service, right? Go bring some food to them or whatever, but to be in relationship.
Right.
That's, I think, what we want to try to look for. The good news is maybe all of this time in isolation gives us some chances to be able to look for that. So look around your city, see where it is that you can begin doing that. One of the things I'd love to do, for example, is I'd like for us to have a relationship with one of the schools nearby, but not up the hill, down the hill. You know what I'm saying?
Yes. Gregory School.
Very good. Very good.
Not the Gregory School. That's right. Somewhere where we can be in a relational space with someone who we would say is not the us as easily. and discover the us in that space. Where else do we do that?
I want to talk to you. My karate sensei is very involved with the Black Pentecostal Church. That I'd like to get the two of you in conversation and see if St. Francis and that they can.
And that's across several different lines, right? Pentecostal sometimes is very different, very conservative, but we need to have that kind of conversation too.
Yes. Not all Pentecostals are that conservative.
Well, but what I'm saying is that whatever lines are there between us, we need to be fearsome enough to cross those lines and be in those conversations. Harvey.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to say the same thing. Well, first of all, I'm a little bit concerned because we're mostly talking about individual action. But if we get involved in a broader organization, such as the school district, then it seems almost overwhelming because the issues are so big. But what we need to do is to carve that down and find those places where we can attack some of those issues that combine those forces of systemic racism and go after them.
Yes, yes. Thank you.
You do know, Harvey, that I've got a group of people that are pushing me to run for TUSD school board.
No, I didn't.
Yeah. I told them not this year, give me about 18 months. I need to make some more connections before I try that.
Well, if you do, and if you're elected, or even if not, if you're going to begin to identify some of those places where we can carve that down from the broader issues into the more specific things that we can do something about.
I'm on it.
Marvelous.
So the good news is that we're moving towards solutions. We're finding some ways in our hearts and in our community where we can begin to address some of this. We won't solve it all perfectly, but we begin to solve it. That's good because we're almost to the end of the book, right? The book, don't we? We have one more week, one more chapter. Next week we're doing chapter 12, and then we'll take a week off, and then we'll start into this book if you want to continue the conversation. This is by Ibram Kendi, and it's How to Be an Anti-Racist. And that class will start, I want to say it's September 1st. That is our first day with that. So that's kind of our.
Jim, will you order me a hardcover book?
I can order one. Yep.
Thank you, because you did for White Fragility, and I so appreciate that.
All right. We should be able. His book is very easy to find these days. There's a lot of stuff that have made it very available. So I'll get one. All right.
And it's certainly on Kindle as well. Yeah.
It's certainly.
One more thing, Jim.
Yes.
I got a suggestion for your movies.
Yes.
Conrack.
Oh, I like Conrack. So just what Leticia is talking about is as the other classes are ending, then I'm gonna start a movie class, and so you have to tell me what movies you want. Melissa sent out a newsletter. If you look in there, you can see a list of some of my favorite movies. And so if you'd like to choose some movies with us and watch those and struggle through the issues that are there, I'd love to have you be in that conversation as well. The two movie classes will be on Wednesday morning and Thursday evening, and then the anti-racist classes will be on Tuesday and Thursday like we have right now with the White Fragility.
Okay.
All right. Thank you very much for your time.
Jim.
Thank you guys for letting me talk so much today.
All right.
We love it.
Harvey.
We love it.
Bye, Paula. Bye, Maureen. I didn't hear from you. Hi, Kay.
Bye.
Bye, Diane.